Morning. My name's Ross Broadhead, and we're going to spend a little time talking this morning about the welcoming prayer. I work in human resources. I love my job. My kids think it's boring. Kim even thinks it's boring, and maybe I'm just boring. But I really do love it. But there's one part of my job that I absolutely hate. It's when I have to get involved in letting someone go from their job. It's not fun to be part of that, firing someone for cause. But when it's done right, it shouldn't be a surprise. They should have had fair warning. They should have had opportunity to correct whatever it was. It's not fun, but it's not something I typically lose sleep over when it's done right. But the brutal part of my job is when someone's getting laid off through no fault of their own. They typically don't see it coming. They've done absolutely nothing to deserve it. And because of that, the emotions in those meetings are as raw as it gets. I've seen the full gamut of responses, from rage to indifference, from grief to laughter, from anxiety to relief. I've been on the giving end of that news. I've been on the receiving end of that news. And more often than not, I've been sort of that awkward third wheel that has to come in and try to explain what's next to somebody who's just heard that news. Every bit as terrible as it sounds. And for anyone who's been through it, I know you know what I'm talking about. Here's the thing about it, though. So I have to talk to people moments after they hear this devastating news. As I mentioned, the range of emotions runs to full spectrum. And then I have to usually meet again with them, sometimes a few days, sometimes up to a week or so later. And I can tell without fail on that second meeting how they're going to do. I can tell if they're going to be fine or if they're going to struggle. And it has absolutely nothing to do with their ability to find another job quickly. It has everything to do with their mindset and their attitude, and to what extent they've been able to accept what's happened to them, even though they obviously don't like it. So I've been asked to speak today about the welcoming prayer. I have to give you full disclosure. Not qualified to speak with authority about prayer. If I had to grade my own prayer life, I'd probably give it a D. And then Patrick would tell me I shouldn't be grading myself, and he would encourage me to do as I can and not as I can't. But I say that only to be transparent with you and to let you know I'm speaking from a place of weakness, not a place of strength. So with that caveat, I would like to dive in and maybe we can learn something together. So the basic concept behind the welcoming prayer is this. It's a way to pray, and it's really a way to posture ourselves so we're able to work through issues and problems each day, small and large, by centering ourselves on God's presence and grace in our lives. So here's how it works. We all face circumstances every day that will trigger negative emotions and feelings in us. The welcoming prayer is a process of first pausing and letting those emotions sink in, to sit in whatever it is that might be going on with us. And then there's a second step of welcoming those emotions, even if they're quote-unquote bad emotions. So we literally say, welcome fear or welcome anger. We differentiate this from the bad things, from welcoming bad things. We don't welcome sickness or injustice. We're not welcoming bad events into our lives. We're only welcoming the feelings associated with them. And lastly, the welcoming prayer asks us to let go. To let go of the things that would hinder us in trusting God and allowing Him to work in our lives. So we may say, I let go of my desire to control, or I let go of my need for acceptance. So we saw an example in that video by Father Thomas Keating of the welcoming prayer. So simple, right? Easy peasy. However, it's not natural, and it's not how we typically respond to these negative emotions in our lives. When we're faced with adversity of any kind, something that would trigger negative feelings in us, we typically respond in one of several ways, most of which aren't very healthy. One of these is denial. It's a common defense mechanism where we create a false reality to cling to because the present reality is too difficult or too painful to accept. So with denial, instead of welcoming negative emotion, we pretend it doesn't even exist. We create a false happiness that covers up the sadness. If we're angry, we create a false sense of calm that covers up the anger. It's clear that denial doesn't work. It's usually pretty easy to recognize in someone else. It's more difficult to recognize in ourselves. We learn this behavior early in life. I'd say usually by elementary school, I would see it in my own kids, right? Where they're visibly upset about something and you ask them what's going on and they insist everything's fine. It's a difficult thing to outgrow. I think we still do as adults. We probably just get a little better at it. By praying the welcoming prayer, we deny denial. We acknowledge the reality of what's going on in our lives. Another way that we'll typically respond is avoidance. Avoidance is a little different than denial. Whereas denial creates a false reality, avoidance simply runs from it. If I flee from it, I can't get hurt and maybe it'll just go away. I grew up a champion avoider. So much so it wasn't even conscious for me to avoid. It was simply what I did all the time. Avoidance requires no investment, no energy, no risk. It's simply running away. It often involves the use of vices, things like alcohol, drugs, but even more benign things like food, television, as a diversion from reality. Avoidance is a passive approach to dealing with negative emotions. The welcoming prayer on the face of it may seem passive, but it's not. We welcome the emotions and the feelings that we are faced with. It's not the welcoming of the bad situations or circumstances. So we can welcome the fear and the guilt and the anger, but we do not welcome the illness, the injustice, or the death. It's an important distinction that is the difference between passive indifference and active acceptance of our circumstance and situation. By praying the welcoming prayer, we allow ourselves to sit in the present moment, a critical step if we're then to move forward. Another reaction is to play the victim. Unlike denial and avoidance, victimhood very much embraces the reality of the situation. However, it doesn't embrace the fullness of the situation, only part of it. When we allow ourselves to embrace being a victim, we only see others' culpability and we only see the injustice and the unfairness of the situation. We don't leave room when we are a victim for God's grace and God's healing. When we're stuck playing the victim, we use a lot of you or them statements, whereas in the welcoming prayer, we use I statements. When we pray the welcoming prayer, we intentionally make space for God to heal and for God's grace to work in our life. Lastly, another possible reaction is to play the avenger. Much like the victim, the avenger also only embraces part of the reality of the situation. Much like denial, the avenger refuses to recognize their own lack of control over the situation. The avenger looks to make right a situation they cannot correct or control. Now, many a person has been inspired by tragedy and the anger generated by injustice to do many a good thing in the world, and that's not what this is. This is referencing when an individual is overcome with anger or rage that cannot be released until fill in the blank happens. This doesn't allow for God's grace in our own lives and for His mercy in the lives of others. The welcoming prayer allows us to acknowledge and welcome that anger, even righteous anger, in our lives without allowing that anger to consume or control us. So we can talk about the welcoming prayer in light of difficulty, in part because it's a little bit easier to highlight how it's supposed to help us and differentiate our response from the typical responses. However, the welcoming prayer is not really intended to be pulled out when times are tough. It's intended to be used on a daily basis. And in doing so, it helps us to slowly tear down the false self. The false self is what we create, intentionally or otherwise, that differs from our true self, the person that God created us to be. Now that sounds a little gooey to me. So dig into this idea of false self. I've heard the concept of finding your identity in Christ all my life. I still have trouble putting that concept into words, but I think I know it when I see it. So if I go back to that original of when someone loses a job through downsizing or closure, whatever the reason may be. It's not always evident, right away of how they're going to do, but I think after some time has passed, this is what comes to the surface. Those who know who they are apart from their job, they're the ones that are going to be okay. I remember one instance of this vividly. I had to meet with a woman who I'd worked with for many years. I liked her. She was an original. Quirky for sure, but she worked hard. She did her job well. She cared about others. She was clearly a woman of faith. She had worked a variety of jobs at the hospital for many years, always seeming to find a place somewhere that she could contribute. I was eliminated. And there were some decisions that were made along with that certainly felt very unjust to her. And beyond any doubt, she had done nothing to deserve losing her job. She was angry and she was vocal. She wasn't rude, but she certainly let everyone in the room know how she was feeling. I met up with her maybe a week or so later, and she was still upset, but she was able to talk about it. And we had this long conversation. I'll never forget this because at the end of it, she got kind of close to me and she said, Ross, I'm going to tell you something, but you better not repeat it to any of the, we'll say jerks. She was a little stronger than that, who work here. She said, Ross, I am okay. I am. I'm okay. I know who I am and who is ultimately in charge, and I know that I am okay. But I really don't want those jerks to know that. So you better not give them the satisfaction of knowing that I'm okay. And we had a nice laugh about it, and she went on her way. And sure enough, I happened to bump into her a few months later, and she was better than ever. And I have no way of knowing if she prayed the welcoming prayer every day. But I can say with certainty she was a woman who understood where her true self, where her true identity originates. That's easier said than done. Because for every one of her, I've met with many whose self-identity and self-worth were tied to their job. And certainly not just work. I can say for my generation, it's really common for us, for our identity to be tied up in our kids. For others, it may be their friends, what car they drive, what house they live in. At the core, it is idolatry. And none of us are immune from it. An adventure that none of us haven't mastered. I think it's getting worse in our culture, not better. Social media is really designed, in part, to promote the false self. There are people I follow on Instagram and Facebook that, if you just read their posts, you'd be led to believe they lead the most exciting, happy, vibrant life ever, right? People on dating sites use pictures 10 years old, right? People post thoughts and ideas, they're their own, and they're not. The internet is so chock full of false self, you feel a bit like a fool if you believe anything you read, 100%. This marital advice I got 26 years ago. My pastor at the time told me that when you get married, there's actually 6 people getting married. Well, that kind of piqued my interest. He said that on my side of the equation, there's who I think I am, who she thinks I am, and who I actually am. And she brings the same 3 people, right, with her. And the misalignment of those 6 people can cause huge problems in a marriage or really in any relationship. And he was right. So these spiritual practices that we're talking about, things like solitude, things like the welcoming prayer, they're really designed to get those 3 people more aligned. So that who I think I am, and who others think I am, and who I actually am are fairly close to the same thing. This is the daily work that we have to do, and it's why the prayer is so important. Not just in times of crisis or difficulty, but in our everyday lives. So as we mentioned, there should be 3 steps to this prayer. The first is to focus and sink in. And sometimes it takes time for this to happen, to allow us to sort of sort out what's going on within ourselves. As Jennifer talked about a couple of weeks ago, often this needs to happen in solitude. The second step is welcome. This can seem counterintuitive, as when we experience negative emotions, our initial reaction may be to suppress them, to fight them. But in this step, we acknowledge or welcome those negative thoughts and feelings. And then the final step is probably the most difficult. It's to let go. It's to let go of our desires that are tied to our false self. Those desires for attention or control or security or whatever it may be. I believe that Jesus in the garden, prior to being arrested, models this for us. As you may recall, Jesus, knowing what is forthcoming for him, goes to the garden with a couple of his disciples, and he leaves them, and then he asks them to pray, and he's going to venture in a little bit farther. But before he leaves them, he says this. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Now that sure sounds like focus and sink in. So then Christ ventures in to the garden and he prays this prayer. He prays, "If it possible, may this cup be taken from me." Now I don't know how Christ prays that prayer without welcoming the sorrow and the angst that he was feeling in that hour. And I don't know about you, but there's comfort in knowing that Christ felt these negative feelings and in fact welcomed them. So then Christ comes back out to the disciples and he finds them asleep. So he wakes them up, he urges them to pray, and he warns them that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, which admittedly sounds a little bit like this fighting the false self that we try to do. He then returns to the garden with a slightly different prayer. And in this one he says, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." Now that to me sounds like letting go. So there you have it, the welcoming prayer. It's rather simple in definition, but let's not make the mistake of thinking it is simple to do. If Lord and Savior sweat drops of blood while walking through this process, there shouldn't be any expectation on our end that this is easy. But it's by no means impossible either. So one last story for you. I mentioned earlier that with job elimination, I've been on all sides of that. And this past spring, when I was able to share my story here with you, you may recall I mentioned at the time that my job was being eliminated. So let me go all Paul Harvey on you, and I'll tell you the rest of the story. So I'd never heard of the welcoming prayer before being asked to speak on it today. I've already told you that I wouldn't by any stretch describe myself as an expert on prayer. But there was something that I did when I learned that my job was being eliminated. They asked me to stay on temporarily for a while with the organization, sort of in a self-serving manner for them, because it was really to help do a bunch of other job eliminations. It was a pretty crummy situation, to say the least. But I did. I made this really conscious effort because I decided to stay. But I made this really conscious effort to every day pray that God would give me the grace that I needed to do my job well, so I could be there for these other people that I was gonna have to meet with that were losing their jobs, and to do that sort of despite my own journey and my own emotions that I was dealing with. And I can say that God in that time did grant me a peace that wasn't anything I would have come up with on my own. Because the Ross I know, the Ross I spent my whole life with, that Ross would have been quietly freaking out. Having just bought a house, having 4 kids going to college in the next 2 years, just been married, would have been really much more focused on all of that. So I can say in that acknowledgement and that letting go, it made a difference for me. And as I said, I can't point it directly to the welcoming prayer because I didn't even know what it was, but I think that process that I was walking through I might classify as a close cousin to the welcoming prayer. In the business world, we have a saying of unconscious competence. It's when someone happens to do something right, even though maybe they're an idiot, and that may have been what happened here with me. But I can tell you that prayer and that posture made a big difference in me. It changed how I approached my work and my day. And the uncertainty of that future was still there, but I wasn't focused and I wasn't consumed by it. And I was able to engage and focus on what was in front of me. Funny thing is my boss noticed it. In fact, a few months later, he met with me and he told me that he had never seen anyone in a situation like mine handle it the way I was able to do it. Just to stay positive and engaged, kind of despite my own fate. So he said, well, I've got this other situation, and can you go and help out, actually up in Michigan, for 6 months or so, and then we'll end your job after that. So at that point, it's like, oh, okay, I'll do that. So I've been going up to Michigan and kind of doing the same thing, and continuing to try to pray the same prayer. That was about 7 months ago, and 2 months ago, he came back and he said, we really love what you're doing. And we need someone like this to permanently be a temporary person. So they offered me this permanent temporary job. Yeah, I don't know what it means either. But there's one thing I've learned, I guess, out of all of it. It's that the welcoming prayer works. I didn't even know what it was, but I've been living it for a while now, and I've seen it make a difference in my life. And I'm not saying that because it's turned into this permanent temporary job, whatever that means, because I'd be saying it even if it hadn't. So the challenge for me now is to engage this prayer more broadly, not just in how I approach my work, but how I approach my life. And my hope and my prayer is that we can all do that, right? So with that, let us pray. I'm gonna pray the same welcoming prayer that we opened with. This is by Father Thomas Keating. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I welcome everything that comes to me today because I know it's for my healing. I welcome all thoughts, feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire for power and control. I let go of my desire for affection, esteem, approval, and pleasure. I let go of my desire for survival and security. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, person, or myself. I open to the love and presence of God and God's action within. Amen. Go forth with a welcoming posture, putting aside our false selves and letting go as we make room for God's grace in our lives and in the lives of others. May the Lord be with you. Amen.